Imagine being stopped on the street, humiliated by someone who wields power carelessly, only to discover the very next day that this person now works for you. In a town like Jackson, Mississippi, where racial tensions simmer just beneath the surface, this shocking twist isn't just a story, it's a lesson in humility and power. But when the tables turn, how will the cop handle the truth? Let me introduce you to Officer Marcus O. Aran, a young man who, on the surface, seems to have it all together. He's 25 years old, a white police officer who grew up in a comfortable middle-class suburban environment. Now, you might think that growing up in the suburbs with its neatly trimmed lawns and quiet streets would be an idyllic way to spend your childhood, and in many ways it was for Marcus. He was shielded from many of the harsher realities of life, including the deep-seated racial tensions that simmered just beneath the surface of his town. It's not that he was unaware of these issues entirely, rather they were like whispers in the background of his life, present, but not loud enough to demand his full attention. Marcus's upbringing was one of relative ease and privilege. His parents, hardworking and dedicated, made sure that he had everything he needed to succeed. He went to good schools, played sports, and was part of a community where most people looked like him. This environment instilled in him a sense of security and confidence, but also a certain naivety. He wasn't exposed to the diversity of experiences and challenges that others, especially those from different racial or economic backgrounds, might face. As a result, Marcus grew up with a somewhat narrow view of the world, one where things were mostly black and white, right and wrong, with little room for the complexities that often define real life. Physically, Marcus is the kind of person who naturally commands attention. He's tall, standing a few inches over 6 feet, with a lean but muscular build that suggests a dedication to fitness. His neatly trimmed blonde hair and sharp blue eyes add to his authoritative presence. When Marcus walks into a room, people notice. There's something about his posture, the way he carries himself, that exudes confidence. He's the kind of officer you might see in a recruitment poster. Handsome, sharp, and seemingly in control. But this outward appearance, this projection of confidence, hides a more complicated interior world. You see, Marcus's confidence isn't as unshakable as it appears. Beneath that strong exterior lies a young man who is still trying to figure out his place in the world. His upbringing, while privileged in many ways, didn't prepare him for the realities of the job he now holds. Policing is a tough profession, especially in a place like Jackson, Mississippi, where the shadows of history still loom large over everyday life. Marcus entered the force with a mix of idealism and determination, believing that he could make a difference. But over time, the weight of the badge, the decisions he's had to make, and the things he's seen have started to take their toll. Internally, Marcus struggles with doubts and insecurities that he doesn't like to admit, even to himself. These doubts are rooted in a fear that maybe he isn't as good at his job as he wants to be, or that he doesn't fully understand the community he's supposed to serve. And because of this, there are times when his authority feels more like a shield than a true expression of his confidence. He uses it to protect himself from the things he doesn't understand or the situations that make him uncomfortable. For example, Marcus has a tendency to react harshly when he feels his authority is being questioned, or when he encounters someone who doesn't fit neatly into his worldview. It's not that he's inherently mean or unfair, it's more that his insecurities come out in the form of unnecessary aggression. It's a defense mechanism, a way for him to assert control in situations where he feels out of his depth. This harshness, while subtle, has started to define some of his interactions, especially with those who are different from him, whether in race, background, or demeanor. One of the more challenging aspects of Marcus's character is that he's not fully aware of these internal struggles. He doesn't see his moments of aggression as signs of insecurity. Instead, he views them as necessary assertions of his role as an officer. This lack of self-awareness is part of what makes his journey so compelling and, at times, troubling. Marcus genuinely believes he's doing the right thing, that he's enforcing the law and keeping order. But he's blind to the ways in which his actions might be influenced by his own biases and fears. This inner conflict often leaves Marcus feeling unsettled, though he doesn't always understand why. There are days when he goes home after a shift and can't quite shake the feeling that something is off, that maybe he handled a situation poorly or judged someone unfairly. But instead of confronting these feelings head-on, Marcus tends to bury them. He tells himself that it's just part of the job, that being a police officer means making tough decisions and sometimes being the bad guy. But deep down, there's a nagging doubt that won't go away, a sense that he's not living up to the ideals he once held so dear. It's this combination of external confidence and internal turmoil that makes Marcus such a complex and relatable character. He's not a bad person, but he's not fully aware of the ways in which his upbringing and insecurities affect his behavior. His story is one of a young man trying to navigate a world that's more complicated than he ever imagined, and in the process, he's forced to confront parts of himself that he'd rather keep hidden. As the story unfolds, Marcus's journey becomes a powerful exploration of humility, growth, and the realization that true strength comes not from the power you hold over others, but from understanding and confronting your own weaknesses. The day seemed to be just another routine afternoon for Officer Marcus O. Aran as he patrolled the streets of Jackson, Mississippi. The sky was overcast, casting a gray shadow over the town, and the streets were mostly quiet, as if the impending rain had sent everyone indoors. It was the kind of day where nothing out of the ordinary was expected to happen, but fate had other plans. As Marcus drove slowly through a predominantly African-American neighborhood, his eyes were drawn to a figure walking down the sidewalk. It was James Matthew, a well-dressed black man moving with a purposeful stride. James wasn't just another passerby. His appearance stood out. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, with polished shoes and a watch that gleamed under the muted sunlight. Everything about him suggested success, confidence, and a certain air of authority. But to Marcus, something about the scene felt off. Marcus's mind immediately started turning, his thoughts shaped by the subtle yet persistent racial biases he had grown up with. This was a neighborhood where, in his experience, people didn't usually dress like that. The sight of a black man in such attire, in this particular area, struck Marcus as unusual. His upbringing, while not overtly racist, had instilled in him certain assumptions that were now coming to the forefront of his mind. Without realizing it, Marcus began to question why James was there. In his mind, it wasn't just that James was well-dressed, it was that he was well-dressed in a place where Marcus didn't expect to see someone like him. It wasn't that Marcus had any specific reason to suspect James of wrongdoing. There was no obvious crime being committed, no immediate threat that James posed. But still, Marcus felt a nagging sense of unease. This unease wasn't rooted in anything tangible, but rather in the biases that had been quietly ingrained in him over the years. These biases weren't necessarily the things Marcus would have consciously acknowledged. They were the kind that lurked beneath the surface, influencing his perceptions and decisions in ways he didn't fully understand. As he continued to watch James walk, Marcus's mind raced. He started to construct a narrative in his head, one where James's presence in this neighborhood didn't add up. What business could this man possibly have here? Why was he so well dressed? These were the kinds of questions that Marcus found himself asking, not because there was anything inherently suspicious about James, but because Marcus's biases told him that something didn't fit. And when things didn't fit, Marcus felt it was his duty to investigate further. So Marcus made a decision driven by a mix of authority, suspicion, and an underlying need to assert control. In his role as a police officer, Marcus had been taught to trust his instincts, to act on that gut feeling when something didn't seem right. But in this case, those instincts were tainted by preconceived notions and a lack of understanding of the broader context. Marcus's need to assert control wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about quelling the discomfort he felt when confronted with something outside of his usual experience. Marcus slowed his patrol car and rolled down the window, his gaze narrowing as he scrutinized James. The decision to confront him was almost automatic, a reflex born out of the authority Marcus held as an officer and the suspicion that had been sparked by his own biases. "Hey, you!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command. "Where do you think you're going?" The question wasn't a friendly inquiry, it was a demand for justification, for an explanation that Marcus believed he was entitled to as an officer of the law. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just enforcing the law, he was asserting his control over a situation that made him uncomfortable. The power dynamic was clear. Marcus, in his uniform and patrol car, held the authority, while James, despite his dignified appearance, was being forced into a defensive position simply because of where he was and how he looked. As Marcus stepped out of his car and approached James, the tension in the air became palpable. Marcus's sharp blue eyes scanned James up and down, searching for any sign of guilt, any indication that his suspicion was justified. But all he saw was a man who remained calm, composed, and respectful, even as Marcus's tone grew more aggressive. The confrontation was set, one man acting out of a need to assert control, and the other caught in a situation where his very presence was being questioned, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was and where he happened to be. Let me tell you about James Matthew, a man who, at 33 years old, carries himself with a presence that's hard to ignore. James isn't just any man walking down the street. He's someone who commands attention, not just because of his physical stature, but because of the quiet strength and confidence he exudes. Picture this, a man with a solid build, the kind that suggests years of hard work and resilience. He's not someone who flaunts his power, but it's there, just beneath the surface, evident in the way he holds himself. His appearance is polished, almost immaculate. He's dressed in a tailored dark suit that fits him perfectly, a subtle yet powerful statement of his success and sophistication. James's presence isn't just about how he looks, though. It's deeply rooted in his character, which has been shaped by a life full of challenges and the values instilled in him from a young age. James grew up in a devout Catholic household, and it's clear that his upbringing has had a profound impact on who he is today. His mother, a woman of strong faith and unwavering principles, raised him to understand the true meaning of dignity and justice. From a young age, James was taught that a person's worth isn't measured by their wealth or status, but by their integrity, their courage in the face of adversity, and their commitment to doing what's right, even when it's hard. His mother's teachings were more than just words. They were lessons James carried with him throughout his life, shaping his worldview and guiding his actions. He learned early on that life isn't always fair, but that doesn't mean you compromise your values. James's sense of justice isn't just about following the law, it's about treating people with the respect and dignity they deserve, no matter who they are or where they come from. This belief has been his guiding principle, influencing everything from his personal relationships to his professional life. Now, when James walks down the street, it's clear that he's a man who knows who he is and what he stands for. His dark suit, perfectly tailored, isn't just clothing. It's a symbol of the journey he's been on, from a childhood filled with challenges to a position of success and influence. The polished watch on his wrist isn't just a piece of jewelry, it's a reminder of the time he's spent building his life step by step, with perseverance and dedication. These details, small as they might seem, tell a story of a man who has worked hard to get where he is, and who carries the lessons of his past with him every day. But it's not just the suit or the watch that makes James stand out, it's the way he wears them. He doesn't strut or flaunt his success. Instead, he moves with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing your worth and not needing to prove it to anyone else. His demeanor is calm, almost serene, even in situations where others might falter. It's this inner strength, this unshakable sense of self, that truly defines James. He's the kind of person who can walk into a room and instantly command respect, not because he demands it, but because he's earned it through the way he lives his life. So, when Marcus Aran sees James walking through that neighborhood, what he's really seeing, whether he realizes it or not, is a man who embodies everything Marcus isn't. Someone who is sure of himself, who doesn't need to assert control to feel powerful, who doesn't let the opinions of others dictate how he behaves. James's presence challenges Marcus's worldview in ways that make him uncomfortable, and it's that discomfort, that feeling of being confronted with something, or someone, he doesn't fully understand that drives Marcus to act the way he does. But James, true to his character, doesn't let Marcus's actions rattle him. He's been in situations like this before, where his presence was questioned simply because of who he is. He knows that reacting with anger or defensiveness would only play into the hands of those who see him as a threat. Instead, he remains calm, composed, and dignified, just as his mother taught him. He meets Marcus's gaze with steady eyes, showing neither fear nor aggression, but a quiet strength that says he knows exactly who he is and where he's going. This encounter, though tense and fraught with unspoken tension, is just another moment for James to live out the values that have guided him all his life. He doesn't need to prove anything to Marcus or to anyone else. His worth isn't tied to the judgments of others, but to the integrity he maintains, even in the face of prejudice and suspicion. And that's the real power James holds. the power to stay true to himself, no matter the circumstances, and to rise above the pettiness of those who try to bring him down. As Marcus stepped out of his patrol car and approached James, you could almost feel the tension thickening in the air. This was no ordinary interaction. It was charged with unspoken judgments and deep-seated biases that had been simmering just below the surface. Marcus, driven by a mix of skepticism and the racial bias that had subtly shaped his worldview, demanded identification from James. But it wasn't just a simple request. The way Marcus asked, with a tone that was both condescending and aggressive, made it clear that this was about more than just checking ID. It was about asserting control, about making sure James knew exactly who was in charge. Marcus wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in situations like this where he felt his authority should be absolute. His voice carried that sharp edge of someone who's accustomed to getting their way, someone who expects immediate compliance without resistance. "Let me see your ID," he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized James from head to toe. It wasn't just what Marcus said, but how he said it. The underlying implication that James, despite his polished appearance, had no business being there and needed to prove his legitimacy. It was a classic power play, one where Marcus was trying to put James in his place, to remind him of the unspoken rules that, in Marcus's mind, defined who belonged where. But here's the thing. James wasn't rattled by Marcus's harsh approach. He'd faced situations like this before, where his very presence was enough to raise suspicion. He knew the game that was being played, and he wasn't about to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Instead, James remained calm, his demeanor steady and composed. There was a kind of quiet dignity in the way he handled the situation, as if he knew that the real power didn't lie in shouting or forcing submission, but in maintaining control of himself. James reached for his wallet with deliberate slowness, every movement measured to avoid any sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. He handed his ID to Marcus, his eyes meeting the officer's with a level gaze. "Good afternoon, officer," James said, his voice polite and respectful, but with just a hint of steel beneath the surface. It was clear that while he was complying, he wasn't doing so out of fear. His response was a mirror to Marcus's aggression. Where Marcus was harsh, James was composed. Where Marcus sought to dominate, James chose to stand firm. And that's what started to get under Marcus's skin. He wasn't used to people like James, people who could take his aggressive posturing and not crumble under it. The more James maintained his calm, the more it frustrated Marcus. Here was a man who wasn't reacting the way Marcus expected, wasn't showing the signs of submission that Marcus thought his authority should command. It was as if Marcus's attempts to assert control were being quietly deflected, leaving him increasingly off balance and annoyed. The tension between the two men continued to build, like a taut wire being pulled tighter with each passing moment. Marcus, struggling to regain the upper hand, found himself growing more irritated by James's refusal to be intimidated. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him, watching this interaction, and it only added to his frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to be the one in control, the one dictating the terms. But instead, it felt like James was subtly turning the tables, not by challenging Marcus directly, but by simply refusing to play the role that Marcus had unconsciously assigned to him. For James, the situation was a delicate one. He knew all too well the potential dangers that came with interactions like this. A wrong move, a misplaced word, and things could escalate quickly. But James wasn't about to let that happen. He understood the dynamics at play, understood that Marcus's aggression was more about the officer's own insecurities and need for control than about anything James had done. So, James remained steady, his responses careful and measured. Each word and action designed to de-escalate rather than provoke. Despite the calm exterior, though, James could feel the sting of humiliation creeping in. It wasn't just about being stopped and questioned. It was about the way Marcus was treating him, as if his very presence was suspicious, as if he had to justify his existence in that space. But instead of letting that humiliation show, James channeled it into maintaining his composure. He knew that in this moment, dignity was his strongest weapon, and he wielded it with precision. The standoff continued, with Marcus growing increasingly frustrated by his inability to shake James, and James feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. It was a clash of wills, one man trying to enforce his authority, the other quietly resisting by simply being unshakable. The tension was almost unbearable, each second dragging out as Marcus realized that his usual tactics weren't working. that James wasn't going to give him the reaction he was looking for. As the confrontation between Marcus and James reached its height, a sudden interruption shattered the tense silence. The crackling of Marcus's police radio broke through, with the dispatcher's voice urgently calling all units back to the station for an immediate situation. The command was clear, and Marcus had no choice but to respond. For a brief moment, he hesitated, caught between his duty and the confrontation he had so fiercely pursued, but the urgency of the situation left him no room to linger. However, even as Marcus prepared to leave, he couldn't resist a final act that would leave a lasting mark on the encounter. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed James's ID to the ground. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, more than any words could. It was as if Marcus, unable to fully assert his dominance in the way he had hoped, resorted to this small, yet deeply disrespectful act. The ID lying on the pavement symbolized the underlying racial bias and contempt that had fueled the entire interaction. Without another word, Marcus turned away, climbed into his patrol car, and drove off, the engine's roar fading into the distance. The abrupt end to the confrontation left a sense of incompleteness in the air, a lingering tension that had no resolution. For Marcus, driving away was a way to escape the uncomfortable reality of what had just transpired. He could avoid facing the deeper implications of his actions by focusing on the urgency of the call from the station. James, meanwhile, stood silently, watching the patrol car disappear down the street. The weight of the encounter hung heavily in the air. Slowly, deliberately, James bent down to pick up his ID from the ground. There was no rush in his movements, no display of anger or frustration. Instead, his actions were calm, composed, and filled with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Marcus's dismissiveness. By choosing not to react with anger, James demonstrated a strength that went beyond the moment. He knew that this encounter was just one of many he had faced, and likely would face again, where his presence was questioned and his dignity challenged. But James also knew that his response was within his control, and in that moment, he chose to rise above the disrespect. Picking up his ID wasn't just about retrieving a piece of identification. It was about reclaiming his self-worth in the face of an unjust situation. James pocketed his ID and stood tall, refusing to let Marcus's actions diminish him. His decision to remain composed, to not let the incident escalate further, was a powerful statement in itself. It wasn't about submitting or accepting the disrespect, but rather about maintaining his own integrity and refusing to be dragged down by someone else's ignorance and bias. As he resumed his walk, James reflected on what had just happened, not with bitterness, but with a clear understanding of the dynamics at play. He knew that the prejudice he encountered wasn't unique to this moment, and he had learned long ago that his strength lay in how he responded to such challenges. His mother had taught him the importance of dignity, justice, and self-respect, and those values guided him now. James's silent reaction wasn't just an act of resilience, it was a reminder to himself that true dignity can't be taken away, no matter how others might try. By choosing to walk away with his head held high, James reinforced his inner strength, showing that his worth wasn't dependent on the opinions or actions of others. This was his way of asserting control over the situation, not by reacting with anger, but by staying true to the principles that defined him. The next day at the police station, the atmosphere was thick with tension. You could feel it as soon as you walked in, the kind of tension that made even the usual morning banter between officers feel forced and uneasy. Everyone knew something big was coming, and the whispers about a new police chief had everyone on edge. Change was in the air, and no one was sure what it would bring. Marcus Aran was among the officers gathered in the briefing room, still shaken from the encounter he'd had the day before. He tried to push it out of his mind, focusing instead on the anticipation buzzing around him. Who was this new boss? What changes would he bring? These questions swirled in his head, adding to his already unsettled state. All eyes turned to him. The usual noise of the room died down instantly. Reynolds, known for his no-nonsense approach, had an unusually serious look on his face. "As many of you know, today we welcome a new police chief," he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "He's someone who has worked exceptionally hard to achieve this position, and I expect each of you to show him the respect and professionalism his role demands." Then, the door opened, and in walked the new chief. Marcus felt his heart drop. It was James Matthew, the same James Matthew he had confronted and humiliated just the day before. Marcus's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Was this real? The shocked expressions on his fellow officers' faces confirmed it was no illusion. His presence was commanding, yet there was no arrogance in it, just a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. As he scanned the faces in front of him, his gaze settled on Marcus, holding it for just a moment longer than the others. There was no anger in his eyes, no sign of revenge, just a calm, knowing look that cut deeper than any words could have. Marcus could feel his stomach twist into knots. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind with painful clarity. The way he had spoken to James, the disrespectful way he had treated him, all under the assumption that he was just another civilian to be dealt with. But now, standing in front of him, was not just a man he had wronged, but his new boss. The realization hit Marcus hard, and the confidence he usually carried drained away, replaced by a deep sense of shame and fear. As James began to speak, outlining his vision for the department, Marcus could barely focus. His thoughts were consumed by the gravity of what he had done. The man he had tried to belittle was now his superior. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically, and Marcus was left grappling with the consequences. His initial arrogance had turned into a cold fear. Fear of what James might do, fear of the repercussions of his actions. As the briefing ended and the officers applauded, Marcus found it hard to join in. His claps were slow, almost mechanical, as he watched James acknowledge the room with a slight nod. When James walked past him on the way out, their eyes met once more, and in that brief moment, Marcus felt completely exposed. The shame was overwhelming, but so too was the realization that he had much to learn. Not just about his new boss, but about himself. The revelation that James Matthew was his new boss hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. As he stood there in the briefing room, the realization of what he had done the day before came crashing down on him. He had treated James with such disrespect, driven by his own biases and assumptions, and now that same man was in a position of authority over him. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Marcus had always thought of himself as a confident, competent officer, but now, that confidence was replaced by a gnawing sense of shame and regret. In the quiet moments after the announcement, Marcus couldn't escape his thoughts. He was forced to confront the prejudices that had guided his actions, to face the uncomfortable truth that he had judged James unfairly based on nothing more than appearances and assumptions. The regret he felt wasn't just about being caught out, it was deeper, rooted in the realization that he had failed to live up to the values he believed he held. The man he had belittled was not only innocent of any wrongdoing, but was someone who commanded respect and dignity in a way Marcus had failed to recognize. Meanwhile, James handled his new role with a grace that only deepened Marcus's sense of self-reflection. From the moment James took the stage as the new police chief, it was clear that he wasn't there to lord his authority over anyone. Instead, James spoke to the officers with compassion and understanding, focusing on unity and reform rather than division. He emphasized the importance of justice, not just in the community, but within the department itself. Respect, he made clear, was the foundation of any successful organization, and it was something that needed to be extended to everyone, regardless of their background or position. James's approach was a stark contrast to what Marcus might have feared. There was no talk of retribution or punishment for those who had wronged him. Instead, James set a tone of collaboration, encouraging the officers to work together to build a better department, one that served the community with integrity and fairness. His leadership style was marked by humility and a deep understanding of what it meant to truly serve others. For Marcus, this was both a relief and a challenge. It meant that his mistakes wouldn't be used against him, but it also meant he had a lot of growing to do to meet the standards James was setting. What struck Marcus the most was James's ability to forgive, to look past the events of the previous day and see the potential for growth in every officer under his command. James wasn't interested in holding grudges. He was interested in creating an environment where everyone, including Marcus, could learn from their mistakes and become better. This approach underscored the themes of humility and forgiveness that were now at the forefront of Marcus's mind. James was offering not just a second chance, but a path forward, a chance to learn, to improve, and to change. In the days that followed, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the lesson he had been handed. It wasn't just about following orders or respecting authority. It was about understanding the true meaning of respect, the importance of humility, and the potential for personal growth even in the face of one's own failures. Marcus realized that this experience, painful as it was, had given him an opportunity to become a better person, to shed the biases that had clouded his judgment, and to embrace a new way of thinking, one guided by the principles James embodied so effortlessly. As Marcus continued to work under James's leadership, he found himself not just doing his job, but actively trying to live up to the example James had set. It was a long road, but one that Marcus was determined to walk, knowing that this was a chance for true redemption and growth. And in that journey, he found the humility that had been missing from his life before, a humility that would, in time, make him a better officer and perhaps a better person. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.